자, 모두 카메라 켜주세요. 우리 어제 사다리 타기로 정한 대로 발표 순서는 3조가 먼저고요. 그 다음에 1조, 그 다음에 5조, 2조, 4조 이렇게 순서입니다. 맞죠? 곧 3조 시작할 거니까 스텝 선생님들 가능하신 분들도 그 캠 켜주시고 다른 친구들도 다 메인 세션으로 불러올게요. Laura, are you here?
Yes. Can you wait? I have my dogs and I think they're gonna bark. So can I'm just gonna kick them out.
Sure. So as discussed, we're gonna have a presentation from team 3 first, followed by team 1, 5, 2, and 4. So as we have been discussed, the presentation is being recorded and it's also live streamed through YouTube. And this is because we would like to track and record the whole video. And then right after the program ends, we'll only open to you and your parents so that they can, or you can resume your videos. And it's not open to public at all. And all after like 2 or 3 weeks later, the edited videos will be uploaded to YouTube to public. So as soon as team 3 gets ready, you can share your own screens and begin your speech. Who will be sharing the screen? Team 3?
I'll be screen sharing.
Sure, you can do it.
It says that I can't. Okay.
Yes, welcome team 3, and you can just feel free to begin. And before I begin, please let me know or let us know who you are and the topic you're going to talk about. And please introduce yourself very, very briefly.
Cool. Hey everyone, I'm Daniel from Team 3, and we are going to be talking about climate change and how to maintain a sustainable environment through a couple solutions.
Hello everyone, I am Jay Kim from Indonesia, and first I will be talking about climate change. Climate change is the long-term change in the climate, and over the past few decades, our world has faced a 50% increase in carbon dioxide level, as well as a 1.2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. It is mainly caused by human activities, such as the burning of fossil fuels that lead to carbon emissions, and its impacts include rising sea levels, droughts, decreasing biodiversity, and more. The graph below shows the increase in temperature over time. Rising sea levels. They are caused by melting glaciers and ice sheets, as well as thermal expansion, which is the phenomenon where the warmer the water is, the greater its volume is. Its impacts include floods, hurricanes, typhoons, biodiversity loss, and many more. Asian countries and countries on the equator, such as Kiribati and Indonesia, are the main victims of rising sea levels. Indonesia's capital city, Jakarta, is the world's fastest sinking city. By 2050, about 95% of North Jakarta will be submerged underwater. Indonesia is taking multiple implementations to stop its rising sea levels, such as building a high protective seawall called the Great Garuda. It is in the form of the Garuda bird that symbolizes Indonesia. Next slide, please. The Indonesian government is also planning to move its capital city to the island of Borneo in East Kalimantan. However, this is facing multiple controversies because of the time and resource limitations. So, learning about the devastating impacts of climate change, what can we do? First, we can follow the 3R policy: reducing, reusing, and recycling. Second, we can utilize clean and renewable energy and replace gas with electricity, such as when cooking. Next, we can raise awareness through education, campaigns, multimedia, and strengthen global citizenship. Lastly, countries can collaborate together to develop climate resilience. Climate resilience is the ability to withstand and adapt to the impacts of climate change. For example, governments can conduct climate risk assessments and then invest in eco-friendly firms, then develop a long-term capacity for their nation, and lastly, develop partnerships for the goals. This is a sustainable and eco-friendly house that I have designed previously. It involves multiple features such as air ventilation, clean energy, less carbon emissions, green or living roofs with plants planted on them, reduced electricity usage, and more. The next solution I have designed is called the water bomb. It takes the form of a bath bomb, but contains nutrients like calcium, strontium, carbonate, and iodine. Once thrown into the ocean, it can restore coral reefs and marine life. Lastly, I will do a SWOT analysis on climate change mitigation. First are the weaknesses. Countries may face finance and time limitations because climate change mitigation is not achieved overnight. It is a slow and steady progress. Second, alternative resources such as solar panels or wind energy can be inefficient. For example, solar energy accounts for 0.01% of total energy production currently. But this is only expected to increase to 0.08% by 2035. Lastly, there may be spatial and sectoral leakages. For example, in rural areas where people are not able to afford durable materials like metal or concrete, they may be forced to chop down trees and use the wood for construction of houses and buildings. Second are the opportunities of climate change mitigation. Developing countries can be willing to develop together, collaborate together, and follow new changes to policies. Second, different policies and projects can interact to maximize the impact. And this may also lead to job creation. Third are the threats to climate change mitigation. Climate change may handicap countries, such as through natural disasters. There may also be poor governance or political instability, perhaps due to corruption, inequality, discrimination, and even war. Lastly, international negotiations may fail due to the uncooperative communities and institutions. For example, after the 2011 United Nations Climate Change Conference that was held in South Africa, the United Nations and some other countries followed the newly set carbon emission limits. However, 5 countries, Japan, Canada, Russia, India, and China, refused to follow these new limitations. Last but not least are the strengths of climate change mitigation. Through climate change mitigations, we can develop partnerships and collaboration, and also have higher education and awareness. People can also experience an increased quality of life with less natural disasters and greater food sources. And last but not least, there will be poverty alleviation with the flourishment of environmental and agricultural sectors.
So hi, I'm Michaela, and I'm going to talk about eutrophication and hydroelectric energy. So to define eutrophication, it is a gradual increase in the concentration of phosphorus, nitrogen, and another plant nutrient in an algae aquatic ecosystem such as lake. First and foremost, fertilizers are the main causes of eutrophication. I'm going to talk about this deeper later. CAFO, or concentrated animal feeding operations, are also the primary source of phosphorate and nitrogen fertilizers, which contribute to eutrophication. CAFOs discharge large levels of animal waste into water bodies, in which the animal waste has a lot of nutrients involved in fertilizers. Sewage water is released directly into water bodies in various regions of the world, particularly in impoverished countries. As a result, it introduced large amount of chemical fertilizers causing algae blooms and other aquatic plants to grow densely, endangering aquatic life in a variety of ways. Aquaculture is the practice of producing shellfish, fish, and even aquatic plants in water containing dissolved nutrients without the need of soil. It ranks as a leading contributor to eutrophication since consumed food particles combined with fish waste can drastically raise nitrogen and phosphorus level in water. If we get into deeper about how fertilizers produce eutrophication, phosphorates and nitrogen nutrient accumulation is aided by agricultural methods and fertilizer usage on lawn, golf courses, and other areas. When these nutrients are drained into lake, river, ocean, and other surface water, when it rains, plankton, algae, and other aquatic plant lives are well nourished. This results in a rapid growth of algae blooms and plant life in aquatic habitats. We can reduce and prevent eutrophication by reducing the source of nutrients that cause eutrophication. For example, we can remove the phosphates from the place sewage treatment is going on and reducing the amount of the fertilizer that we use when we grow plants. Also, we can use the buffer strips that is believable that traps the eroding soil particles. Also, the old sediments that are near the water should be removed because even though the external nutrients is reduced, the internal nutrients might not be reduced because of it can come from the sediments and prevent the increasing of the water quality. As youth, we can prevent overusing the fertilizers when we are taking care of our garden or field, and making sure that we are not pouring any chemical into lake, river, ocean, or any other natural water source. To define hydroelectric energy, it is a form of energy that harnesses the power of water in motion, such as water flowing over a waterfall, to generate electricity. The way of the hydroelectric energy works is the most hydroelectric power plants have a reservoir of water, a gate to valve to control how much water flows out of the reservoir, and an outlet or place where the water ends up flowing downward. Water gains potential energy just before it spills over to the top of the dam to flow down a hill. The potential energy is converted into kinetic energy as the water flows downhill. The water can be used to turn the blades of the turbine to generate electricity, which is distributed to the power plant's customers. There are 3 different types of hydroelectric energy plants. First is impoundment facility that uses a dam to store river water into a reservoir. Second is the diversion facility that uses a series of canals to channel following river water toward the generator powering turbines. Third is the pump storage facility that collects the energy produced from solar, wind, and nuclear power and storage for the future use. Hydroelectricity energy is the most commonly used renewable source of electricity. China is the largest producer of hydroelectricity. Other top producers of hydropower around the world include the United States, Brazil, Canada, India, and Russia. Approximately 71% of all the renewable electricity generated on the Earth is from hydropower. There are a total 4 benefits of deep hydroelectricity energy, and the first benefit of the hydroelectricity energy is irrigate support. Because the storage of hydroelectricity generation can improve water supply from irrigation, dams could be operated to build up a high hydraulic head and then release the water to produce hydropower. The second benefit is clean water because the energy generated through hydropower relies on the water cycle, which is driven by the sun, making it renewable. Hydropower is fueled by water, making a clean source of energy. The third benefit is flood control, because the dam that is used to connect the generator and the water prevent the water from getting over the land and create the flood that will damage the land. The last benefit is the characteristic of hydroelectric energy, which is the fact that it is renewable, which means we can use it again, not just throwing away in one use, which can give benefit to the environment by decreasing the GHG emission and decreasing the air pollution.
The topic I'll be talking about is air pollution. To begin with, what is air pollution? According to WHO, it is a contamination of the indoor or outdoor environment by any chemical, physical, or biological agent that modifies the natural characteristic of the atmosphere. In simple terms, it's a situation in which unwanted chemicals, particles, or gases enter the air and threaten the life of or the environment on Earth. Air pollution used to be widely discussed throughout the world, but recently there isn't as much attention given to the growing issue. Although the global and news trend for air pollution had dropped over the years, air pollution remains as a serious problem. While countries such as the US reports that air pollution has significantly decreased compared to the Industrial Revolution, for example, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which even provided graphs that supposedly prove that the concentration of pollutants and emissions have significantly reduced, reports on air pollution in 2022 by the WHO says that almost the entire global population, about 99%, breathes air that exceeds WHO air quality limits and threaten their health. Furthermore, reports on air quality by WHO in 2022 said there are approximately 7 million deaths each year from exposure to ambient and household air pollution, 2.4 billion people in the world using polluting fuels and technologies, and 91% of the world's population lives in places where air pollution exceeds the WHO guidelines. Moving to some places that have the most severe problems, the case study in India reveals air pollution is the second largest health risk in India, reducing the average life expectancy of India as a whole by 5 years and 7.6 years of life expectancy for 40% of the Indians in the Indo-Gangetic Plains, which is the most densely populated area in India. Also, due to air pollution, respiratory diseases and aging of the lung are much faster in India, especially for children. According to the report in 2020, air pollution killed more than 116,000 infants in 2019, and many children in India had higher risk of developing problems with brain development, cognitive abilities, and potential chronic diseases in the future. Despite such a problem, India's air quality is extremely under-monitored. The report says there are at most 0.8 monitoring stations for every 1 million people, which is compared to other countries such as China with the ratio of 1.2 per million, or the US 3.4 per million is very low. While there are measures that are being taken, India remains as one of the most air-polluted countries in the world. Moving on to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is notorious for being the most polluted country in the world for many years. The air pollution in Bangladesh had reduced the average life expectancy by 6.7 years and at most 8.1 years. The air quality level of Bangladesh is 4 times the WHO index, which according to the Air Quality Life Index is about 75.8 particulate pollution, which means about 75.8 particles were found in every drop of liquid. Also, respiratory diseases in Bangladesh are increasing with around 210,000 patients with respiratory problems found yearly in a single hospital, according to the National Institute of Diseases of the Chest and Hospital in Dhaka. Finally, despite the efforts being made in Bangladesh, reports in 2021 say that approximately there was an increase of 7 to 10% in air pollution. So what are the main causes of air pollution by humans? The first major cause that contributes to the majority of air pollution is greenhouse gas emissions. This usually comes from industries or burning fossil fuels, which have contributed to many health problems. The second major cause is dust. Dust that contributes to air pollution is created from situations such as poor water management, for example, the desiccation of the Aral Sea in the 1960s, industrialization, etc. The third cause is transportation. The third cause is part of the first cause, as cars or other forms of transportation burn gasoline, which pollutes the air. The last cause is household energy. Although many people in the cities often use electricity as their main form of energy, polluting devices and fuels are still widely used, such as methane gas, air filters, etc. Of course, there are many more causes of air pollution, but the four are the major contributors to air pollution. The general effect of air pollution is contributing as one of the world's leading risk factors for death, attributing to 11.65% of death globally, contributing to the cause of many respiratory diseases, and more. So how can air pollution be reduced? The first possible way of reducing air pollution is by following the WHO Global Air Quality Guidelines, which have been made in 2021. The report provides explanation and guidelines to governments regarding the recommended air qualities. By following these guidelines, countries can expect gains in life expectancy years, reduce in respiratory and other health problems, and other benefits. Second way is to enforce more environmental laws. While there are many countries that have strict environmental laws to reduce air pollutions, countries such as Asian countries or Africa have very few environmental laws that monitor the situation of air pollution. Another way of reducing air pollution would be funding. As countries in Africa or Southeast Asia aren't as developing as other countries, plans for reducing air pollution are difficult. Therefore, funds can benefit them to contribute to the reduction of air pollution. Finally, we can also contribute to air pollution by using less polluting devices such as cars, plastic, paper, etc. Also, by spreading the information about severity of air pollution, we can help take a closer step to reduce air pollution.
Hello, I'm Yuha, and I will be talking about waste prevention and resource circulation as solutions to greenhouse gas emissions. One of the main causes of climate change, which Jay previously mentioned, is greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases are mainly caused by human activities, mainly industrial practices. Greenhouse gases absorb heat and trap it on Earth, and if the concentration of these gases are left uncontrolled, it can result in a negative impact on climate change. Next, please. As of 2020, global greenhouse gas emissions are mostly by energy, which account for 73.2%, and also a great part of it is consisted by manufacturing industries. Among the industry sector emissions, some of the main causes are leaks from industrial processes or equipment, composting of waste in landfills, emissions through chemical reactions while producing goods, and lastly, energy production and overconsumption. A solution for these causes of greenhouse gas emissions in industrial practices is to reduce and reuse through waste prevention and resource circulation. The first step is waste prevention. Waste prevention means to minimize the usage of materials and try to not make waste in the first place before taking additional measures such as reusing and recycling. Waste prevention has many positive effects in reducing greenhouse gases. First, by reducing energy to extract, transport, and process raw materials and to manufacture products, we can reduce emissions from energy consumption. Secondly, by reducing waste such as paper products, we can conserve more trees, which can then absorb and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And lastly, we can reduce methane emissions coming from landfills. The second step is to reuse and recycle through a resource circulating society. A resource circulating society is a society in which its members minimize the use of natural resources by reducing the generation of wastes and using the generated wastes as materials or energy to the maximum extent possible. This is a resource circulation loop diagram, and from this we can see that it tries to minimize the input of new raw materials, and the process focuses more on the 3 R's and make sure that the materials are circulating and reused to the maximum extent possible. This report, a roadmap for sustainable waste management resource circulation in South Asia, was adopted with the goal of setting a specific policy framework and elaborating targets and measures to structure an efficient waste and resource management system in South Asia. Currently, South Asia creates 334 million tons of waste every year, and an increasing amount of e-waste, construction and demolition waste, plastic and marine litter, and so on are becoming a serious issue in need of attention. The main goals of this report are to minimize waste generation and maximize resource utilization, and to foster the cooperation between local, national, and sub-regional actors to elaborate on more specific targets and agendas, including the SDGs and NDCs, to form a more efficient management circulation system. This report highlights the significance of bilateral and multilateral cooperation and research and mutual learning within the sub-region on sustainable management. If we take a look at another case, this is an example of resource circulation by ESG companies in Korea. This business has been producing eco-friendly compounded resin by recycling plastic bottles, and as of 2021 produced 25,000 tons during the year. And by cooperating with other businesses that produce plastic bottles, such as this cosmetics company, they are expanding the project by aiming to recycle at least 100 tons of plastic a year and trying to increase the ratio of eco-friendly compounded resin to the products by 50% in 2050. The expected outcome of this project is to reduce 61,000 tons of annual CO2 emissions, which has the same effect as planting 903,000 trees or reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by 30,000 cars. This shows that resource circulation is a great solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The solutions mentioned, such as waste prevention and resource circulation, are deeply connected to the SDGs. First, it supports Goal 11 because the process of developing resource management stimulates creative innovation in various fields to expand sustainable projects in our society. Also, it is related to Goal 12 as the solutions previously mentioned deal with responsible actions to control production and consumption. And lastly, they are connected to Goals 13, 14, and 15 because resource management contributes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental conservation overall. Now, another action that we can take as individuals is to adopt a zero waste lifestyle. A zero waste lifestyle means to take responsibility in consumption and reduce and reuse waste in our daily lives. To elaborate, first of all, we should minimize disposable products and prioritize reusable items. And secondly, we should adopt a organic diet by consuming organic, locally grown foods, plan our meals, and avoid packaged foods. And lastly, we should try to save energy by using rechargeable batteries and unplugging unnecessary electronics. Through these efforts in our daily lives, we can reduce our carbon footprint and contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Hey everyone, it's Daniel again, and I'll be giving 2 additional solutions to mitigate the effects of climate change. And first, we'll start off with solar energy. So for those of you who don't know, solar panels are basically panels that receive energy from the sunlight and turn it into electricity. So why should the world go solar instead of sticking with the fossil fuel system that we have now? The first reason is because it's 22% energy efficient. What this means is that out of the 100% of the sunlight that shines onto these solar panels, 22% of that sunlight is then absorbed and turned into electricity for any household user to use. The second reason is because it's the most abundant energy source. With things like fossil fuels, there's a limited amount of coal, oil, and gas, but there's not a limited amount of sunlight because anytime during the day, there's going to be sun. So you don't need to worry about this abundant energy source running out because it literally cannot run out. While with coal and fossil fuels, it might run out in the future, which is why it's becoming more and more expensive today. The third reason is because it can generate electricity even if it's cloudy. One common myth surrounding solar panels is that it needs to be direct sunlight from the sun to the solar panel in order for there to be any kind of generation of electricity, but that's just not true at all. The reason why is because when it's cloudy and the sun shines onto the cloud actually reflects the sunlight onto these solar panels, and these solar panels are still absorbing the sunlight in the first place. So in the long run, solar panels can still use energy. But even if it's raining or if it's dark, if you have a solar panel battery that actually absorbs the energy during the day, you can use that energy in the battery at nighttime. So solar panels are not a problem, even if it's raining or even if it's night. The fourth reason is because it's the fastest energy source to set up. With things like fossil fuels, you need to find the source of coal or oil, and then you need to connect that to the nearby power plant, and you need to connect that fossil fuel plant to your house in order to get any kind of energy running. But with solar panels, all you need to do is set them up at your house or apartment and just connect it to your house and your solar battery, and that's that. The fifth reason is because it's a free energy source. Despite the high initial cost of actually having these solar panels, it's still a lot less than what you would spend monthly on fossil fuels in the long run. Because all you need to do is spend some money towards the start and have a free energy source that shines on your house instead of having a constant money that you have to spend on fossil fuels every single month. And the final reason is because it emits zero pollution. Though it may have some pollution in order to actually make these solar panels in the first place, it is still on net less pollution than you would emit if you were to use fossil fuels in the long run. So now let's look at the current path of solar energy. Because the world has started to realize the benefits of solar panels and how it outweighs the harms, we can see that as of 2010, there was barely any solar energy, but in a projection to 2030, we've seen exponential growth. And this will only keep happening as more money and more investments are being poured into the industry in the long run, so it becomes more cost effective and energy efficient. That's why we see in the first chart on the left here, we see how countries like the US, China, and India have all led the development in solar energy. And we also see that South Korea is starting the development of solar energy, something that's only going to increase in the long run. So let's talk about the effects of solar energy and solar panels. The first effect is lower emissions. We can see that a solar panel system emits 80% less carbon emissions than fossil fuels, even after building these solar panel systems. This means that in the long run, if you emit 80% less carbon emissions than fossil fuels, then you're on that better off because you're saving the environment. The second reason is because it saves lives. Like Brian mentioned earlier, 7 million people die every single year due to air pollution deaths. But by 2030, if we install 400 gigawatts of solar PV capacity, there will be a 1.2% decrease in air pollution related deaths. Even though 1.2% may not seem like a lot, it's still tens of thousands of people, considering that 7 million people die each day, and saving 1% is better than saving 0%. The third and final reason of the effect of solar panels is low cost. Solar technology is now cheaper than fossil fuels in most countries, either because it's subsidized by the government or because there's been so much investment that has been poured into the solar industry that now it's becoming a lot more cheaper than fossil fuels, which are running out. That's why if you want to save money, you're able to develop and use these solar panels for your house so that you can save money in the future. The second problem with the status quo is that transportation actually accounts for 27% of greenhouse emissions, which my teammates have mentioned earlier. And the way to actually transform this 27% into 0% is with high-speed rail. So for those of you who don't know, high-speed rail is basically a really fast train. They travel at 350 kilometers per hour, and they're a lot faster than normal trains or even airplanes. That's why we should switch to high-speed rail. Because the first reason is because it's 8 times more energy efficient than airplanes, and it's also 4 times more energy efficient than cars. What this means is that it decreases the amount of energy that you use per person, and it ends up decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, even if it uses fossil fuels. That's why in the long run, if we all develop high-speed rail and replace airplanes and cars, then we can improve the air quality and lower carbon emissions in the air. So we can see the current progress with high-speed rail globally. We see that China is on the rise. We see that China is basically taking over the high-speed rail market, but we also see that Japan, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and even South Korea are all starting to develop high-speed rail, and this will only increase in the long term. Because if we look at the second chart on the right here, we see that as of decades ago, there was literally no high-speed rail, but in the past recent decade, there's been exponential growth in the high-speed rail industry, and it will only continue to increase, which will decrease carbon emissions and air pollution in the long term.
Keeping in mind the SDGs and the values of climate change mitigation and sustainable environments, we must listen to our Mother Nature and strive to comprise a sustainable and equitable living. Implying our knowledge on climate change and sustainable environments, we should raise our voices and expand our good influences through innovative solutions, such as eco-houses, water bombs, high-speed rails, resource circulations, hydroelectric dams, and more. As George Bernard Shaw quoted, progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thank you so much, Team 3, for your amazing presentation and the solutions. And I would like to welcome our next presenter, Team 1. So if you feel free, anyone can share your own screens for the presentations and begin at your convenience.
I will share my screen.
Yes, please.
Hello, we are Team 1, and on the topic of economic stability and economic development, we chose the topic of the economic aftermaths of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis.
To understand the war between Russia and Ukraine, we have to look at the timeline of history between the two nations. The Russo-Ukrainian War originated due to political conflicts between Ukraine and Russia long before the 21st century. During the 20th century, until the demolition of the USSR, Ukraine was officially known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and was part of the Soviet Union. Also, even before the occupation of the Soviet Union, the Crimean War took place in the 19th century, caused by the territorial dispute over the Crimea Peninsula. From 1932 to 1933, the Great Ukrainian Famine occurred, leading to the death of 10 million civilians. The famine was caused because of the collectivization policy implemented by the Soviet under the control of leader Joseph Stalin. After this tragic incident, the Second World War broke out, causing over 5 million casualties in Ukraine. Luckily, 5 decades later, in 1991, as the era of the Cold War came to an end, several nations, including Ukraine, gained freedom from the Soviet Union and became independent countries. In 1994, 3 years after its independence, several nations signed the Budapest Memorandum to admit Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial rights. However, as the 21st century started, the Orange Revolution occurred. The revolution happened as the corrupted government controlled the 24 presidential election through several political frauds and media manipulation. Countless Ukrainian civilians were running to the streets and protesting against the election results, which led to Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-European politician, becoming the president. A few years later, in 2008, Ukraine applied to the NATO Membership Action Plan, which is also called the MAP, to seek a solution to avoid Russia's threat and ensure the civilians' safety. Russia said NATO is breaking its promise to the past Soviet Union. In 1990, after the famous Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union and NATO concluded that there would be no territorial expansion to Eastern Europe. However, as the Warsaw Pact got dissolved, which is a pact that the Soviet Union made during the Cold War era, it got dissolved in 1991, and most countries in the pact and other nations that were part of the USSR began to apply to NATO, which caused it to expand to Eastern European regions that are adjacent to Russian borderlines. However, as the presidential term of Yushchenko came to an end, the next president, Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian politician, tries to maintain a good relationship with Russia instead of the European Union and Western European nations. As a result, through fear protest, Yanukovych gets impeached, and in 2014, Russia caused the Crimean crisis to have authority over the peninsula and the Black Sea fleet that they possess by claiming they're invading for the safety of Russians inhabiting the peninsula. Now, they are using this as a superficial reason because most people who are inhabiting in that peninsula are Russians. As Russia annexed the Crimea Peninsula, several pro-Russians got influenced and caused the war in Donbass, located in eastern Ukraine, to liberate from Ukraine and maintain good relationships with Russia again. This war has caused a civil war in Ukraine and led to several casualties, which is approximately over 14,000 people. And as pro-Russians were heavily armored with weapons supported by Russia in private. In 2022, Ukraine tried to apply to NATO again, and Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is currently going on as the situation is exacerbated. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Russia was trying to get the authority over the Crimea Peninsula in 2013 because it has great geological characteristics for both economic and military usages. And it is adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea where transportation takes place. The Russo-Ukrainian war is still going on as casualties and economic losses are increasing day by day. Now, Jenny will talk about the economic impacts of the war in Russia. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jenny Key, and I'll be talking about the economic impacts from the war in a continent called Russia. So, talking about the economic sanctions on Russia, the initial round of sanctions was extremely mild. The sanctions included restrictions on travel, set phrases, and the prescribing of business dealings with certain individuals and enterprises, including entities based in Crimea and Sevastopol, which are areas in Russia. However, after tensions rose in the Ukrainian war with months of ongoing battles and destruction, sanctions were tightened considerably in many areas. The export and import of arms were forbidden. Sorry. The export and import of arms were forbidden, as was the export of dual use of goods for military use. Exports of certain types of goods related to oil exploration and production were also banned. However, among all of these sanctions, the most important and significant sanction was the curtailing of long-term financing of Russian companies that had no direct involvement with the fighting. And we call this the famous SWIFT ban. So I'll be focusing on what the SWIFT ban is and then what SWIFT means. SWIFT, which is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a member-owned cooperative. As the Gmail of global banking, SWIFT is used by thousands and thousands of financial institutions in more than 200 countries, including Russia. And then SWIFT provides a secure messaging system to facilitate cross-border money transfers in many areas. SWIFT directs trillions of dollars in transactions, including orders and confirmations for payments, trades, and currency exchanges. In March, the US and the EU cut off 7 Russian banks from SWIFT, such as VTB and Bank Russia. On June 3rd, the EU added 3 more banks, including the Sberbank, which has twice as many assets as any other bank in Russia. Therefore, the Sberbank can be perceived as one of the most major and biggest banks in Russia. Sberbank's international operations were already heavily restricted after the US and UK froze its assets and ordered their banks to stop working with Sberbank. Therefore, now I'll be talking about the impact of these sanctions and how the Russian economy was impacted by these sanctions outside in the global countries. So, the economic sanctions affected Russia from the first day of the invasion, with the stock market falling by up to 39%. The Russian ruble fell to records low as Russians rushed to exchange currency in their banks. Furthermore, stock exchanges in Moscow and St. Petersburg were suspended until at least the 18th of March, making it the longest closure in Russian history. On the 26th of February, S&P Global Ratings, a global place to rate the economic situations in each of the countries, downgraded the Russian government credit rating to junk, causing funds that require investment-grade bonds to dump Russian debt, making further borrowing currency very difficult for Russia. So then, focusing on the SWIFT ban again. Now I'll be talking about how effective the SWIFT ban was, because among all of these sanctions, the SWIFT ban was the biggest and the most powerful ban and sanction among all. The Russian economy and society are being hit by so many different sanctions. And by the war itself, it's difficult to disentangle their effects. However, adding to their challenge, Russian banks suspended monthly reporting of financial information when the war started. According to a March 31st report by independent Russian news agency Interfax, the central bank estimated that Russian banks may lose as much as 5.8 trillion rubles, which is approximately $93.8 billion in American dollars, in 2022, due to sanctions and from participating in measures to support the economy. So first question. So people can ask numerous questions about the SWIFT ban, and now I'll be explaining about two questions that are normally asked. One, it's about the reluctance that EU countries have towards the SWIFT ban. So why the reluctance to cut all Russian banks from SWIFT? And then the answer is Germany, for instance, which relies on Russia for more than half of its gas supplies and more than a third of its oil, in particular resisting adding Sberbank to the list. Sberbank is a major conduit for EU and the Russian trade. And if the Russians couldn't get paid for their fuel, they can be counted on to stop providing it. And if Russia stops providing natural resources to the EU countries, then the EU countries will suffer from big downfalls. And then the second question, is there no alternative to SWIFT? Because definitely some people might think that there might be other ways and other systems they can use to exchange SWIFT. However, currently there is no alternative to SWIFT. If some people might know about the Chinese currency and the Chinese banking system, they might think of CIPS, which is a cross-border interbank payment system. But however, the CIPS is mainly a settlement system for renminbi transactions that also offers some communication functions. Therefore, most banks still use CIPS to communicate via SWIFT. Now, one question that a lot of people can have regarding the Russian economy is because there's a lot of different media sections and a lot of different news articles that talk about the future of the Russian economy. And then they talk about whether the Russian economy will be recovering in this current situation and rather reach its peak at the very top in 2024, where some experts are talking about that the economy of the Russian government is going to plummet, going further into the war. So during my research, I was able to find some contradictory predictions, and I found those very enthusiastic and interesting. So first of all, the White House predicted a downfall of Putin and the economy. And also from Oxford Economics, Central Bank, and Economic Development Ministry forecast, they believe that there will be a contraction of a 7.8% to 10% shrink in the Russian GDP. But however, Russian news media and a several number of experts perceive this as a stabilization of the Russian economy, and rather, they predict Russia is recovering in a rapid speed. After the Central Bank of Russia announced interventions, Russia tried to stabilize the market. On the 28th of February, it raised interest rates to 20% and banned foreigners from selling local securities. Therefore, as this slide is saying, higher prices for oil and gas exports have so much diminished the effect of sanctions on the Russian economy and provided the Kremlin with strong revenues that Putin and the Russian government can direct towards supporting the economy and the armed forces. Now, overall, this is the conclusion for the Russian economy. Looking and observing those contradictory predictions, though the Russian economy currently seems to be rebounding, Russia will experience a downfall in the long term due to its decisions that is made from Putin and the Russian government. Thank you.
My name is Taeyang Lee, and now I will cover how the war impacted Ukraine regarding tangible damage, trade, general economic impact, and aid from foreign countries. First of all, Ukraine experienced tremendous amounts of tangible damage from the war with Russia. Urban centers in many parts of the country have been badly damaged, and maritime, road, and rail transit have been severely disrupted. Vital economic and social service infrastructure, including power generation, digital infrastructure, bridges, and ports, has been destroyed or rendered unusable. $108.4 million worth of damage to the infrastructure were done. Among the people, 12 million were displaced, becoming refugees, and 3.5 million were rendered homeless. Moreover, a similar number of people, especially the elderly and infirm, are in need of humanitarian assistance. War is very likely to have a particularly negative effect on children, since it can increase malnutrition, reduce years of schooling, and worsen labor market outcomes. You can see that in pictures the damage done to the buildings in Ukraine's capital Kiev from Russia's military attacks. It is no surprise that so many people lost or had to abandon their normal lives because so much were lost from the war. While this is an estimated amount, this statistic on the left shows how the Russian invasion led to direct losses of housing, transportation, and industry. And on the right, these are infrastructure damages done because of the war in numbers. And and from the numbers, it is evident that the infrastructure and resources, which are crucial for the society to function, were severely damaged. This will most likely leave huge economic burdens on Ukraine for recovery in the future. It is worth mentioning how Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe for its fertile farmland, and that it is one of the top grain exporters, especially in wheat and corn in the world. Russia used this to their advantage by deliberately destroying Ukrainian croplands to limit crop produces. For example, Russia attacked Agribul dairy farm on the left, and there are evidence of artillery attacks on agricultural fields in Ukraine, as shown in these photos. The UN is taking measures to increase food production by supporting local farmers and working with governments. Ukraine also experienced damages to its trade. As mentioned before, Ukraine is one of the biggest grain exporters, but war caused wheat to be stuck in the country, unable to be exported. Goods trade in general has come to a grinding halt. This is because damaged transit routes impeded shipment by land, while the loss of access to the Black Sea cut off all seaborne trade, which accounts for half of Ukraine's exports. To solve this problem, Russia and Ukraine signed the Black Sea Grain Agreement, a plan initiated by the UN. Moving on to general economic impacts, war was undeniably a threat to the economy, as Ukraine's economy fell by approximately 40% as a result of Russia's invasion in February. Ukraine imposed emergency financial measures as a response, including capital controls and banking sector restrictions. It also announced tax deferrals while fully meeting domestic and external debt obligations. These measures at least prevented financial collapse. Multiple institutions, such as the National Bank of Ukraine, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the IMF, predicted the economy to shrink by 1/3 in 2022, but the World Bank estimated its decrease as much as 45%, which accounts for almost half. However, the economy is expected to grow between 5% and 6% in 2023 to 2024. Additionally, while the war is a major cause of inflation, Ukraine's interest rate did not change much, maintaining at 25%. The war had devastating effects on the country, but Ukraine could receive military, humanitarian, and financial aid and support from multiple countries globally. 20 countries gave assistance packages for Ukraine, 47 nations joined the Ukraine Defense Contract Group, and $40 billion aid were sent from the US to Ukraine and other countries affected, including $19 billion of immediate military support and $16 billion in economic support by May 2022. And as you can see in this graph, the USA and EU provided the most support to Ukraine. When looking at the support provided to Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky's role cannot be overlooked. He utilized his entertainment background and savviness in media to further drive support for Ukraine, and he became the face of the resistance in the country. He continued to deliver messages to governments globally in order to rally support while staying in Kiev. It is no doubt that his actions could drive support for Ukraine, helping the country maintain its position, both in military and economy. Considering these factors, Ukraine experienced great harm in many facets as a result of the war. However, its economy has a potential of slow recovery without collapse.
Hello, my name is Taeyong Yu, and I'll be talking about the war's global impact. So until now, we saw the Ukraine and Russian impact of the war, and for some people, it might seem irrelevant. However, it is directly influencing the world economy, influencing every single consumer on Earth. So I will talk about the global impact of this war. Russia accounts for 10% of global oil production, and the demand for fuel has risen to pre-pandemic levels. Sanctions have lowered the Russian export of oil and natural gas, and this has largely increased global fuel prices. Countries that depend largely on Russian fuel have seen the worst damage. Europe is heavily reliant on Russian fuel, ranging from oil to natural gas. Gazprom, a major Russian fuel company, has decreased its supply of natural gas to Europe to 20% of its original capacity, and it has been impacting Europe to a massive degree. The price of oil rose above $100 a barrel, while European natural gas prices initially surged by almost 70%. Energy-intensive industries are suffering from the skyrocketing fuel prices, and some experts even predict a fuel shortage in the future if Russia completely cuts off its fuel supply to Europe. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe are heavily reliant on fossil fuels due to their lack of sustainable energy sources. Latvia has been 100% reliant on Russian fuel before the war, and the fuel crisis is impacting such countries the most. Italy and Germany are also struggling with fuel crisis, having been largely dependent on Russian fuel.
South Korea is a country that relies 100% on imports for oil and gas. After the Ukraine war, the global crude oil price has hit a record high of $116 per barrel. As you can see, the gas prices have risen greatly from before and after the war. To deal with this increased fuel price, the Korean government has lowered the fuel tax by 37%, which is the maximum decrease possible under the law. As a result, since November 2021 until July 2022, the estimated tax loss is 9 trillion Korean won. Despite this government effort, the citizens aren't experiencing much relief since the prices have risen too much compared to a year before. As such, Ukraine-Russian war has been devastating nations' economies by impacting the economy's energy source, fuel. So now there's a video about the citizens talking about the fuel price. Food crisis has been triggered by the war due to the Russian naval blockade that is preventing Ukrainian grain exports. This is a major problem since Ukraine is one of the largest grain exporters of the world, and countries in the Middle East and North Africa are heavily reliant on Ukraine and Russia for their grain supply. Ever since the Russian naval blockade began, Ukraine has had to store their grain in silos, having to let it rot when people around the world are starving. A recent event in relation to the food crisis was the Black Sea Agreement. The Black Sea Agreement was carried out by the UN and Turkey, and Ukraine and Russia each separately signed the agreement. The agreement guarantees safe passage at the ports of the Black Sea, where Ukraine's grain exports mostly went through before the sea was compromised by the war. Russia would also resume the export of food and fertilizer. So why is this significant? As a result, at least 20 million tons of grain will be released, which will ease the global food crisis and also support Ukraine by bringing at least $1 billion for Ukraine. Some might wonder why Russia agreed to reopen the Black Sea ports if it would benefit Ukraine. But Russia also benefits from the agreement because the UN agreed to support Russia's food and fertilizer exports. For Russia, this is a considerable benefit since they are major exporters of fertilizers. According to recent news, India has started importing substantial amounts of Russian fertilizer, showing how the Black Sea Agreement has started to benefit Russia. Fuel and food price inflation affects consumers to a great extent, since most of their consumption is directly associated with food or transportation. For example, with higher grain and fuel prices, it will cost more to bake a loaf of bread, to use the oven, and to transport it to the grocery store. Like this, a wave of inflation has been overwhelming the world, especially in developing countries. Usually when an economy grows, inflation is inevitable. In such cases, inflation isn't necessarily a negative event. However, inflation that happens without any economic growth, or even worse, negative economic growth, is called stagflation. In this situation, unemployment rates rise, but prices rise higher than usual, and it is the worst economic situation economists try to avoid. One of the countries experiencing severe inflation is Turkey. The annual inflation rate was 78.62% for June, which was a record high in 24 years. This means that if you could buy $10 worth of products in June 2021 with $10, you need almost $18 to buy the same amount of the same products in June 2022. The reason why Turkey is experiencing such drastic inflation is its reliance on Russian gas. 45% of their gas is imported from Russia, but Russia is cutting off its gas supply as a part of the war. Such an inflation is putting millions into poverty, and Turkey's people are getting restless.
Now I'd like to talk about the suggestions and solutions about this crisis. So I'd like to suggest two questions in the chat. So the first one is, which SDG do you believe is the most crucial to solve this crisis? And the second one is, which SDG is the most affected by this word, like infringed? Are there any volunteers, or I can pick? Okay, so I'm sorry, but Lucas, would it be fine if I ask you, which SDG do you believe is the most important to solve this crisis? You can find only one.
Hold on, let me think about it.
Okay.
Okay, to briefly explain, I just want you guys to all participate in this because related to SDGs, we have learned SDGs for a couple of days. And I would like you guys to incorporate like your knowledge about the SDGs to solve the current crisis, because currently a lot of countries are being involved in the Ukrainian crisis, but there's no such thing as a fast solution to this incident. So I would like you guys to participate and think about what SDG is most greatly related to the current Ukrainian crisis. It can be related to poverty because it's really also related to the food chain. It can also be related to the SDG 16 because it's kind of like there are a lot of like UN nations and UN nonprofit organizations involved in the crisis, and there's a lot of donations going on the internet, on the media. So please share your just freely share your ideas. Just raise your hand.
In my perspective, I think SDG 17 is the most important to solve the Ukraine crisis, because SDG 17 is a global partnership, finds the most attention, and it calls for a global partnership for sustainable development. The goal highlights the importance of global macroeconomic stability and the need to mobilize financial resources for developing countries from international sources. So yeah.
Thank you for your idea.
Is there anyone from Team 3 who wants to answer this question? Yeah, sure. Jay.
I feel like SDG number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, is the most crucial when stopping the war and overcoming its aftermath. For example, like NGOs and strong institutions can collaborate to help the refugees in Ukraine, and they can also deliver necessities like water, food, shelter, and clothes to Ukraine. And governments could collaborate together to maintain peace, to bring back peace to Ukraine again.
Thank you. I really like that idea. Is there anyone from Team 4?
Team 4.
Yeah, sure, Han.
Yeah, I also agree that the SDG 16 is the most important when solving a war crisis because it emphasizes peace. And one of the goal targets of SDG 16 is to reduce all forms of violation in the world and reduce death rates. And I think the Ukrainian crisis is mostly involved. People's lives are being threatened, and the global society having attention of securing peace and securing human lives in Ukraine is really important in solving the situation. So I think SDG 16 is the most fundamental SDG to solve the Ukrainian crisis.
Thank you for sharing your idea. Is there anyone from Team 5?
Go ahead.
I also believe that SDG 16 is probably the most important because until peace and justice until this conflict is resolved, not only would there be no peace and justice, but there will be an increase in poverty and hunger and etc. So I believe that SDG 16 is the most crucial.
Thank you. Well, there were if anyone have more to say or more opinions.
So about the first question, if I have an idea about it, so now for me, I was a bit different with you guys with SDG 16, 17. So this crisis, I believe that it should be solved through SDG 9 as its primary goal is aiming to ensure safe infrastructure. Hence, we can reconstruct the destroyed infrastructure of Ukraine through global collaboration and let individuals participate in civic organizations and do activities such as donating. So I guess there aren't any people for question number one. So the following question, which is, which SDG is the most affected by this war? Are there any volunteers in Team 2? Yes.
I think SDG number 3 has been very affected by the crisis because the good health and well-being of citizens in Ukraine has been affected, and also the around countries' well-being has been affected because they are worried about wars happening in their country. So I think SDG number 4 is most affected. Thank you.
Thank you for your idea. Are there any in Team 3? Yes.
Again, I think, wait, can you go back to the SDGs?
Oh.
Yes, I think partnerships for goals have been the most affected because political relationships between countries have been broken, and Russia's relationship with other countries have also been damaged because of this war.
Thank you for sharing an idea. Then are there any volunteers in Team 4?
If not, like any one of you can freely share ideas. It's an open space for every part, like everyone's ideas. So please feel free to go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. Aaron first.
I think for question number 2, Zero Hunger SDG number 2 has been heavily affected because of the war in Ukraine. A lot of agricultural, like the production of these crops have been limited, and the production of food in general has been limited. So for these reasons, it's also going to be our next topic. There's a lot of refugees, as you know, another reason to why, you know, because there's like a shortage of amount of foods, hence why a lot of organizations like the FAO has been trying to help local farmers in Ukraine to increase food production. So
thank you.
Yes.
Well, since according to the time, we're going over the 40-minute line.
I'll wrap it up with the Team 1 idea. So so I divided into 2 perspectives, which is the perspective of the global one and the one for Ukraine. So now, to begin with, from a global perspective, I believe that SDG 8 would be the most affected as the economy has been plummeting due to the prolongation of the war, And on the other hand, in the case of Ukraine, like someone said on Team 2, SDG 4 is the most affected by this war, as most education infrastructures were demolished by war, leading to a high learning poverty rate across the nation. And this problem will not only affect the country's current situation, but also significantly impact in the future society. And thank you for our presentation.
Yes, thank you, Team 1, for trying to be very interactive. And I would like to welcome the next speaker. So please feel free to share your screen, Team 5, from anyone, and you can begin your speech.
Hello, we're Team 5, and we would like to talk about human rights, especially the human rights of refugees. The reason why we chose the topic to specifically refugees is because they are in need of desperate help in very diverse perspectives. This can be connected to the SDGs that the United Nations proposed: Goal 2, Zero Hunger; Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities; and of course, our main topic, Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, and much more. So to give you a broad roadmap of what we're going to talk about today, first, we're going to talk about what exactly refugees are, and then talk about why refugees leave their homes and give examples. Lastly, we will widen the viewpoint by analyzing what has been done and providing our own perspective of what we can do. So to begin with, it will be impossible to talk about refugees without knowing what refugees are. Some simply understand refugees as people who are in danger and want to leave where they live. The definition itself that I just talked about is not wrong, but we have to be more accurate. So, what are refugees? Refugees are persons who are outside of their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and, as a result, require international protection. Then why did I put migrants below this? Because many of you might confuse between refugees and migrants, and dividing these two definitions are very important. As refugees, the definition itself was defined by the United Nations. Migrants are not defined in an international order. This is because if we define the term migrants, then it will be too complicated with refugees that we really have to protect. So, what are migrants? Migrants are not defined in an international level, but is oftenly understood to imply a voluntary process. For example, someone who crosses a border in search of better economic opportunities. So, for example, when we talk about the American dream from the very past, and these kind of people go to America to search for food and like money and all sorts of things. This can be also called as migrants. So, why should we talk about refugees and migrants at the same time? This is because it is important to differentiate between the two to understand different protection to the two. So the purpose of moving for the refugees is for their country of origin has significantly disturbed their public order. On the other hand, migrants, their purpose is to change their main country of residence. So therefore, for the refugees, the protection is held to provided by the international law. So international law provides many protections. For example, like refoulement, which is these kind of people can move to another country, cross borders without getting arrested, even if they do not have a visa, because they are in a very significant and life and death matter. So they have to move quickly so they do not get arrested. On the other hand, migrants, they're of course protected by human rights. For example, their rights to not get discriminated, or their rights to have food or to drink or etc. However, the protection such as refoulement is not occurred because we believe because for migrants, the sovereignty of each nation is more important than the rights of the migrants to move whatever they want. So now we have to, because we know what refugees are, divided between refugees and migrants, now we have to think about what types of refugees we can actually see in the society. So these refugees can be divided into 6 types: anticipating refugees, semi-refugees, impelled refugees, war refugees, ex-police, ex-camp inmates, anticipating refugees. So all sorts of these 6 types. So anticipating refugees are people that have already made use of an escape in necessity. So for example, these anticipating refugees have already a lot of money and a lot of social status, so therefore they can easily make ways to go out of their own country of origin and move to another place wherever they want, or they already have a home in another country. Semi-refugees are refugees that did not actually get significant harm as a society as a whole. However, this individual, because got harmed and got injured, so therefore this refugee as an individual must leave. Impelled refugees are refugees who are forced to leave their own country for specific reasons. War refugees are people who became a refugee during the war. So, for example, because in war situations, borders move quickly, and also people move to another region to escape from the war itself. These kind of people easily become out of their country's borders, or even becomes some kind of like very dangerous. So, therefore, these kind of war refugees can be also called as refugees. Expellees are people who are simply kicked out of their country. So therefore, they do not have any place to go. So therefore they became a refugee. And lastly, ex-camp inmates are people who just came out of the camp. So for example, the way we call camp is camps like the Archwich camp. So kind of people were inside a specific country or etc. because of the war or many other reasons. However, when they just came out of the camp, and they do not have their country, they do not have a home, and they do not have any protection. So therefore, they can be also called as refugees. So I talked about these 6 types of refugees and compared between the refugees and the migrants. And next, Aaron will talk about why refugees need to flee from their homes.
Hi, my name is Aaron, and I'm going to talk about why refugees flee their homes. First of all, there are essentially 5 major reasons refugees may be compelled to flee their homes, which are war, religious, national, social, racial, political, persecution, hunger, climate change, or sexual orientation. I'm going to talk about each one of them and give certain examples that are relevant to them. So to begin with, war. As of 2022, millions of refugees around the world have been forced to leave their home countries due to war. And one of the most recent and up-to-date examples is the Ukraine war, which has caused around 12 million refugees to be displaced. Refugees displaced due to war can face various problems and dilemmas, such as lack of adequate healthcare, food, housing, employment, clean water, and hygiene, alongside loss of community and homes. Secondly, persecution is one of the main reasons people become refugees. It can take place in various forms, such as religious, national, social, racial, or political reasons. One well-known example is Hindus in Pakistan who face persecution. The photo here is basically a photo of Dalai Lama, which many of you might know of. He is a political refugee. So political refugees are basically refugees who are exiled or have fled from their home country due to political persecution, majority being influential or inspiring individuals. Many refugees flee in search of stable food sources, and the majority of these refugees are affected by other factors too, such as persecution or climate disasters. Approximately 20 million people in Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen are facing extreme drought, which has led to many refugees being forced to leave their homelands in search of stable food sources. Many end up in informal refugee camps like the town of Mangunu in northeastern Nigeria with poor conditions. It is predicted that 13 million people will be displaced due to climate change in 83 years. However, climate change climate change is not a valid reason for asylum officially. In 2013, a climate change refugee from Kiribati was refused asylum by the New Zealand High Court. However, as climate change worsens, these laws may need to expand their scope. Many LGBTQIA+ refugees face discrimination globally. And even as they resettle in their new countries, they face discrimination, which make them more vulnerable. And as being part of the LGBTQIA+ community is being criminalized globally, there are an increasing surge of refugees fleeing due to their gender or sexual orientation. Finally, I'll pass the floor to Aaron, who is going to talk about examples of refugee crises across the globe.
So as a follow-up to RN's presentation, I will be presenting examples of 2 different countries that are known to be struggling with a huge refugee crisis. Is everyone aware of the current situation in Ukraine right now? To briefly explain, after centuries of a difficult relationship between the 2 nations, on February 24th, 2022, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. They sent their military to take power over certain areas of Ukraine by force. And in early February, Russia sent military troops over to Kyiv, but later abandoned its push towards the capital and continued to move to cities in the south and east areas as of now. The invasions heavily impacted Ukrainians. The use of tanks and bombings of civilian infrastructure has caused people to leave their homes and find shelter elsewhere, in addition to several soldiers that have died in the war. This caused a lot of people to leave Ukraine for neighboring countries such as Poland to seek asylum. Through news outlets, the world has also seen the total destructions of schools like colleges. The profound number of Ukrainian refugees seeking asylum in other nations is honestly it's significant. According to the UN, quote, as of July 4th, more than 5.2 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded across Europe. More than 3.5 million people have applied for temporary residence in other countries. As you can see on the screen, these are some stats that have been recorded by the UN. The most significant in rank is Russia right now. There are currently 1,412,425 Ukrainian refugees seeking asylum. Fortunately, Ukraine's bordering country, Poland, has opened its door with, holding hands with other EU nations. It's not on the chart, but it was recorded that there are an additional 141,562 refugees seeking asylum in Italy. The numbers have been tallying up almost every day. The International Organization for Immigration, also known as IOM, estimates that more women, especially physically vulnerable women, pregnant women, those with younger children, or with a disability, or even victims of sexual assault, are being internally displaced. I won't get into the specifics, but there are many organizations that are currently finding ways to keep the support of Ukraine. For example, the UN is teaming up with other organizations to provide the necessities such as food and cash for refugees. There have been a lot of donations and moral support, not just from Ukraine's neighboring countries, but really the whole world, even here in Korea. From walking around bookstores to watching the morning news, we've all seen and heard the stories of North Korean refugees, or also known as defectors. The geographical separation of North and South Korea has brought the separation of the people for decades. However, the lives of both nations differ so greatly. We were able to recognize these through the stories that the North Korean refugees wrote and testified. These are just a few factors to why thousands of people decided to escape. To start off, their freedom of voice has been banished. North Koreans aren't allowed to leave the country. As we have seen through so many news headlines, North Koreans are banned from basically leaving. The isolation resulted in thousands risking their lives to escape. In addition, technology is extremely limited. The media is limited to the extent where only the government allows, mostly exposed to propaganda and extreme limited news about the rest of the world. Those who are allowed to legally leave are, the country's elites, delegates, government officials. If you criticize or critique the government in any way, you could be hugely responsible for being imprisoned. The heavy repression of expression or freedom, basically. You can't publicly say a single word of criticism towards the government. You have to respect and essentially preach the government in a way. In any case, if you are jailed, you're sent to a prison camp where people are tortured, or even in worst case scenarios, exiled, depending on the extent of the crime. It is, well, crime really, but it has been said that 5 political prison camps imprison up to 80,000 to 120,000 people as of now. In there, they're forced into labor and starvation, and many have testified of being a survivor of sexual assault, and you can see through the image on the screen. In addition, North Korea pursues the idea of conformity. For example, there are certain hairstyles and clothing that have to be kept as a rule, if you can see on the screen. A lot of North Korean defectors have utilized the internet to talk about their experiences, and they weren't all bad. A lot have talked about missing a strong part of their culture. However, many choose to leave their home country because they want more opportunities to live in freedom. So next, I'll pass it on to Sunny, who will be discussing the works that have been done for refugees.
I'm Sunny, a presenter of Section 4, What Has Been Done for Refugees. I will explain the past efforts to protect the human rights of refugees in the international society, especially United Nations. United Nations protect the human rights of refugees by establishing an independent organization called the UNHCR, which means United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, also called the UN Refugee Agency. Founded by the United Nations General Assembly on December 3, 1949, the UNHCR was empowered to lead and coordinate international measures to protect refugees and also asylum seekers, stateless people, returnees, and internally displaced people. The UN Refugee Agency helps refugees with 5 directions: protect, respond, include, empower, and solve. Their activities are primarily aimed at protecting the rights and welfare of refugees. Next, I will explain 2 specific and representative policies that UNHCR is working on. The first is the Refugee Resettlement Program. Some refugees cannot or do not want to return to their home countries due to the risk of continuous persecution. Under such circumstances, UNHCR is the safe, realistic, and permanent solution to help resettle third countries. The resettlement provides refugees with legal and physical protection, including political, economic, social, and cultural rights, at a level similar to that for their citizens. Refugees often resettle in new countries with completely different social structures, languages, and cultures because they have to move to a safer place regardless of their own will or choice. Therefore, it is important to provide programs to help refugees adapt. Government and NGO partners promote social integration through cultural orientation, language and vocational education, and employment promotion programs. In 2016, UNHCR delivered files of more than 162,500 refugees to the resettlement offices. The major beneficiaries of the UNHCR-led resettlement program by country are refugees from Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and Somalia. The second is the Global Compact of Refugees, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 17, 2018. This agreement emphasizes the importance of international cooperation to solve the refugee problem in a sustainable manner and stipulates that countries share the responsibility for protecting refugees. The 4 key objectives of the Global Compact are reducing the burden of refugee acceptance, increasing the economic independence of refugees, expanding access to third country settlement measures, and finally helping refugees return home safely and with dignity. There are 2 specific examples of UNHCR helping refugees. The first example is the Jatari refugee camp in Jordan. This camp is a symbol of the Syrian refugee crisis. 10 years ago, Syrians moved to their neighbor country, Jordan, to escape civil war. The UNHCR set up the camp for Syrian refugees in 2012. There are still 80,000 refugees living in the camp. The UNHCR has set up fixed caravans instead of tents to provide a better environment for refugees. Refugees forged kind of new society there. Over 10 years, 20,000 babies have been born there, and economic activity has been carried out through 1,800 markets. UNHCR provided free healthcare to refugees at 8 healthcare facilities in Zatari. The camp is also supported by other UN agencies, NGOs, and the government of Jordan, as well as the UNHCR. The following example is a relatively recent example. The UNHCR is active in helping Ukrainian refugees caused by the Russo-Ukrainian War. Poland was not originally a refugee-accepting country, but it has recently received the largest number of Ukrainian refugees. The UNHCR is working with Poland to help refugees. They are supporting government-led efforts by focusing on protection services, cash assistance, emergency supplies, and reception capacity. As of today, UNHCR has established 8 cash enrollment centers in the main refugee hosting areas in Poland. Over 100,000 refugees from Ukraine have already received financial support from UNHCR to cover their basic needs such as paying rent or buying food and medicine. We looked through what United Nations has done for refugees, so now we can move on to the next part. Melania will explain what can be done for the future.
Thank you. Now I will present the final part of our presentation, what can be done for the future. Here I will present what can be done on 3 different levels, on international level, on a local level, and on an individualistic level. So first, on an international level, the UNHCR, as has been presented by my fellow colleague, has aided refugees for a long time. However, while Sanya has explained what the UNHCR has done, I will explain what they continue to do and can do. So what the UNHCR continues to do is send peacekeepers from the UN to often guard the refugee camps. They also provide necessities like shelter, blankets, household goods, clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. They also assist people who arrive to new countries by arranging transportation and assistance, and also provide income-generating projects for resettled refugees. So they try to provide them assistance in terms of jobs. And also, in order to achieve international standards for refugee protection, the UNHCR works with governments to refine and improve their asylum legislation and procedure. They in total, they have 10 priorities that they obligate governments to follow. These 10 priorities are reception standards, persons with specific needs, child protection, protection of women, quality asylum procedures, integration, family reunification, naturalization, alternatives to detention, and ending statelessness. These all can be summarized in terms of promoting respect for refugee rights, providing expert advice on draft laws to ensure compliance with international standards, technical assistance and legal advice to strengthen refugee status determination procedures, and monitoring to ensure that separated children have access to the national child protection system. Now I would like to move on a more local level. So here I will explain what governments can do, but also what associations and organizations can do. So first, governments can grant even more access to asylum. So many countries such as Egypt or France take several years in order to grant asylum in their countries. Thus, in addition, they can also allow events to raise money to bring refugees to their countries. So through sponsorships, many refugees were able to arrive in safe countries such as Canada, and now UK, Australia, and Ireland are gearing to follow suit. They can also reunite families. So through family reunification, it is, according to human rights, mandatory for governments to allow refugees to join their family members who are already settled abroad. Next, they can also allow medical, work, or study visas. So medical visas can be offered to refugees with serious medical conditions that can get treatment in countries such as the United States. However, in 2017, when Trump announced a 4-month ban, many refugees lost any hope of recovery. So now we have to avoid these kind of events to be repeated. Next, the government can offer work visas. So a job is vital for refugees. Work permits can aid refugees and also give specific skills as well as training, but also aid the economy of that certain country. Next, they can give study visas. Study visas, although more targeted to the younger generation, these refugees can still receive education and contribute to society. Lastly, they can scale up resettlement. This is an essential way that governments can protect refugees who are in need of protection. These keep people who are often those who have been tortured or women at risk of abuse. However, it is a solution that is underutilized. In 2016, 1.2 million people needed resettlement. However, only 189,300 refugees got the chance. And at present, only 30 countries offer this service. Now I'll talk about associations and organizations. So most associations strive to ensure that refugees and displaced people are protected, empowered, and welcomed in their communities. They do this through tailored health and sanitation programs and by offering educational services. They also provide emergency relief, safe and secure shelter to vulnerable people, and strengthen the capacity of refugee camps and communities. Now I would like to move on to the last part on an individualistic level. So how can people help these associations or governments? Well, first, they can donate money. So they can donate money to several organizations such as the International Rescue Committee, Refuge Point, and many more. They can buy merchandise directly from these organizations that can directly help them as well, or they can engage in volunteer work if they prefer if they prefer physical and more direct help. And they can also share stories of these refugees. They can constantly remind people that refugees are still in need of help, and that they still need aid from us. And also they can hold awareness and fundraising events. So fundraising events can vary from parties or to even sport events. And lastly, there's also hosting refugees in your own home, but this is often not really done because it is a complicated procedure. And lastly, what can the youth do? So we as students, what can we do? So to be honest, we can mostly do what the other things that I have just mentioned. However, some of them can be in smaller scale, such as creating a fundraiser. So this, instead of being a sort of nationwide fundraiser, it can be mostly a local in our own local community or at school. We can also volunteer and also just simply keep up with what's going on. So through programs such as this one, we can keep up and we can also learn how to help refugees and how to assure that their human rights are guaranteed. So in conclusion, all people, even the youth, have a voice. And we have to use this voice to assure that all refugees can have their human rights. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Team 5, for the amazing presentation. And I would like to take our next presenter, Team 2. And who will be sharing the screen?
Me.
Yes, please, Flora.
Hello, we're Team 2 with Chemin, Lucas, James, Angela, and Flora. Today we're going to present about educational inequality. This is the table of contents. We're going to look at why education is important and what is educational inequality. Next, we're going to look at gender inequality in education, a socioeconomic status that influences educational inequality, and lastly, finish the presentation with the solutions to educational inequality. First, we're going to look at why education is important and what is educational inequality. We can say that education is important as it gives us the opportunities for social climbing. It is the key to escape poverty, which is SDG goal number 1. It will lead the road to an equitable, prosperous, and healthy society. It will teach us to be independent, like being able to have self-dependency and protecting yourself, and lastly, for the future generations. Educational inequality is about the disparity of access to educational resources between social groups. These resources include school funding, experienced and qualified educators, books, technologies, and school facilities such as sports and recreation. Educational inequality can also be defined as the inequality between students in access to quality education due to the disruption of schools caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. To look at the factors that educational inequality has brought to America, there are government policies, choice of schools, family wealth, residential location, parenting style, choices of schools, and lastly, implicit bias toward a student's race. Educational inequality lessens the educational academic success or performance of students or populations by the unequal distribution of educational opportunity, financial and educational resources, qualified teachers, or digital assets. A good education is not just only about academic and professional performance and opportunities, but it also takes an important part in moving forward to becoming more civilized and human society.
Hey everyone, this is Lucas Park from Team 2, and today I'll be presenting about how gender affects educational inequality. I'll give a brief introduction to gender disparity before getting into the educational issues brought on by gender. So, what exactly is gender inequality? Gender inequality is a social phenomenon in which men and women are not treated equally. Differences in genetics, psychology, or societal cultural standards may be the cause of the treatment. While some of these divisions have empirical support, others seem to be social constructs. Or to put it another way, is sex or gender discrimination that favors one sex or gender over the other on a regular basis. Gender-based discrimination infringes on the fundamental human right to gender equality. Next, why does gender inequality exist? The causes of gender inequality are found in the distinctions that exist between men and women in society, including those based on biology, religion, and economics. It stems from the biological distinctions between the sexes, such as the capacity for breastfeeding that led to the sexual division of labor. Economically speaking, women's roles are regarded less, and they frequently have restricted mobility and are confined to their home. Women frequently endure many forms of discrimination, such as social, domestic discrimination, institutionalized, and community, which negatively impacts their well-being and maintains their inferior status to men in the patriarchal system. Now, how can we relate gender inequality to educational inequality? When discussing gender inequality in education, we first consider the barriers to schooling for girls and young women. And for a good reason, 3/4 of the children at risk of never going to school are girls. Yet disparities exist in other dimensions of education, sometimes for sometimes to the detriment of boys. To reduce them, IAP UNESCO, which is also known as UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning, favors an intersectional approach, which looks at gender through all other forms of discrimination and social exclusion. Here's how it works. According to UNESCO data, the number of girls enrolled in primary and secondary school has increased by 180 million over this period, including 69 million in sub-Saharan Africa. Yet girls and young women still face the most severe forms of exclusion, which are the result of several cumulative factors. Among them are socioeconomic status, place of residence, ethnicity, religion, and living with a disability. Also, according to UNESCO, an average of 130 million girls between the age of 6 and 17 are out of school, and 15 million girls of primary school age will never enter a classroom. Globally, there is a significant gender disparity in schooling, which may be caused by a number of intersecting identities. The most frequently cited causes of the gender gap include deprivation, isolation due to geography, violence, physical or mental impairments, a lack of infrastructure, or a membership in a marginalized ethno-linguistic group. According to the research, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa have the greatest rates of gender inequality in schooling. As school proceeds, we also observe an increase in the percentage of female students who miss school. The percentages of young girls and women who are not in school are shown on the map below. You can see how percentages rise as your degree of education rises. South Sudan is where there is the greatest gender disparity in schooling. It's one of the hardest places in the world for girls to receive an education. Sudan also have an egalitarian views towards women and has some of the highest rates for forced marriage. According to an index released last year, South Sudan is the country where it is hardest for girls to get an education because nearly 3/4 of them don't even go to primary school. As of February 2021, women had 28.5% of the seats in South Sudan's parliament. To attain gender equality, however, more needs to be done in South Sudan. In addition, in this country, 51.5% of women between the ages of 20 and 24 were married or in a union before turning 18 are prevented from pursuing an education. So what should be done by us individuals to prevent these problems? I've come up with 3 straightforward and doable solutions that we may use in our day-to-day life to address these issues. First, segregating male and female students should be avoided. Not only does gender segregation prevent male and female students from learning to interact socially, but it also prevents non-binary kids from feeling accepted and seen. So stay away from activities like boy versus girls games, for instance. Fostering the collaboration of all genders is another goal. Lastly, refraining from using gender language and prejudices. For instance, instead of using fireman and policeman, we can use firefighter and police officer. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I learned a lot from taking this fantastic session, and we should definitely fight to address the gender imbalance as well as the educational discrepancy. Next, Flora will explain the educational inequality caused by socioeconomic factors.
Educational inequality caused by socioeconomic factors. One of the factors that causes educational inequality is an individual's socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status, which is a way of defining people by their education, income, and their type of job, can mainly be separated by 2 ways. 1. Students or people with low socioeconomic status are the people with low academic achievements and low family income. High socioeconomic status meaning the opposite, the people with high levels of academic achievements and high family incomes. Then what is their difference while performing in academic and social lives? Many studies, including APA statistics, show that low SES students tend to have lower grades and have trouble performing above average level in their academic years. High SES students tend to have higher grades in school, leading them to more various career paths and job opportunities in the future. The supportive parents who invest into their children a lot more than low SES students receive. Also, some students have had opportunities to attend preschool previously attending elementary schools. On the other hand, students with low SES generally experience behavioral problems during their academic studies, and also they attend high school with literacy skills that are 5 years behind students with high SES. They also have the highest dropout rate of 11.6% among students aged 16 to 24, according to statistics. They also show poor performance in STEM education and other subjects, reducing the chances of getting a bachelor's degree at the age of 24. Why are they so underperforming in certain fields or during their school lives? The main reason here is focused on the family environment. Because of poverty and low SES students' backgrounds, they have a higher chance of getting underestimated in school, along with the society itself not giving them the opportunities and chances to invest and find what they want to do in the future because they are busy working in order to survive. School system itself can be one of the main factors as well. Students in which they are located in the low SES community tend to have lack of resources to provide enough and safe studying environment for students. Also, because of the psychological stress and poor health outcomes, which are a result of governments not supporting the nation's health system, making it harder for the low-income families to go to hospitals when they are sick is also one of the issues as well. Some studies even show that the low SES household have a high chance of child abuse and child neglect.
Education inequality by socioeconomic applies not quite only to differences in personal wealth, but also to economic disparities between country and country. Before moving into the explanation, let me define a few words that will be mentioned multiple times in today's explication, which are LEDC and MEDC. LADC stands for at least economic development country, which is a developing country, and MEDC stands for most economic development country, well known as a developed country. Now, as you can clearly see, there are 6 major factors that cause the education gap between LADC and MEDC. A. Poverty of country itself. B. Corruption of the government. C. Lack of security. D. Poor facilities. E. Child labor. And finally F. Political characteristics. It's quite obvious how lack of money extends to a lack of education. If the country runs out of its money, it can't afford education facilities. I mean, such things as books, schools, classrooms, and you name it. If you lack facilities, it'll now be such a hard challenge to provide a better education than a place with much better facilities compared to you. Then now moving on to government corruption. LADCs often don't have proper government system, which makes the country vulnerable to government corruption. Because of such an unfortunate characteristics, corrupt government often happens in LADCs. This corrupted government uses its money and taxes not for its own citizens, but rather for itself. Such a phenomenon makes the government not think of a citizen's education even more and makes the country's security fall also. Speaking of which, a country lacking its security makes diverse serious problems, including educational inequality. Then how does a security form educational inequality? It's because it makes parents fear the act of sending their children to school due to so many hazards just out of their window. Like, think about it. Which parents would like to send their children to school when there is a risk of death with every step of their children when they just step out of the door? Rather, they are more likely to arm their children and make sure of their safety. This becomes an obstacle and prevents children to go to school and being educated. What's even more is facilities that can't accommodate children. To explain this, let's review the previous factors I mentioned. Government lacking money, security, and being corrupted. These 3 factors make poor education facilities that cannot actually give even the least education to those children. Child labor also plays a role in educational inequality. People living in LADCs can't afford to care about education, which is a long time value. Citizens in LADC are relatively more in poverty. They are busy enough worrying about their immediate meal. This causes parents living in LADCs to prefer to send their children to workplace over the school. Thus, just expecting them to care more about their children's education is too much of a burden for them. Finally, most of the LADCs are non-democratic governments, which means that they are with dictatorships. Dictatorship countries are politically reluctant to educate their people. The reason is that if the people of your country are well educated and develop a sense of freedom and the desire to defend their rights, it becomes very difficult to control them. Dictators want people who are easy to control, and those people don't need a high quality education. These political reasons also contribute to the educational inequality of LADC. Because of these factors, LADC countries may have lower quality or no access to education than MEDC countries. If so, let's be more specific about the impact of these factors. Obviously, the educational inequality between MEDC and LADC will be further exacerbated by the various causes of educational inequality mentioned earlier. Worse, LADC countries will be forever left behind if they fall into this educational inequality. Education and information are the most basic stage of development and the most powerful weapon to fight against poverty. However, if this information and education gap widens for a number of unavoidable reasons, MEDC and LADC may never be on equal footing. This means that the citizens of LADCs will forever be in poverty and will be deprived of their opportunities to climb up the social ladder. At the national level, LADCs will be left behind in terms of national development as they will not be able to nurture and utilize human resources. Let's list some countries where these horrific educational inequalities are more particularly prevalent. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to more than half of the world's out-of-school students. Further, there are only 1.5 million schools with about 250 million students enrolled in India. According to a survey, 37% of students in rural areas and 17% in urban areas don't study at all. Just to add, Slovakia and New Zealand, Australia is ranked as the most unequal in the world on a combined ranking of education inequality across preschool, primary, and secondary schooling, which means that we and all other organizations need to focus on these nations. Last but not least, I brought some statistics about educational inequality between LEDC and MEDC. The pie chart I located on left side shows you the gap in education level between LEDC and MEDC. The blue part represents people who didn't learn a basic level of education. Black stands for people with basic primary level of education. And green shows people who learned the minimum secondary level of education. And the pie chart on the very left is a graph that shows low income countries. The middle one is for middle income countries. Finally, the last one is for high income countries. And the bar graph on the right side shows the mean years of schooling for adult population. The orange bar is for developing regions and the red one is for developed regions. To conclude, we can also see in the statistic that educational inequality is a serious problem. Next on the floor will be my superior teammate James Lee explaining the educational inequality caused by COVID-19.
First, I will explain how COVID-19 caused education inequality. The closure of schools due to the corona crisis negatively affected children. This is because in a pandemic situation, not all children have the opportunities, tools, and accessibilities that are necessary for studying. For millions of students, school closures will result in a sudden and permanent suspension, not a temporary suspension of schoolwork. And there are also some examples of countries that were affected by COVID-19. First, in the world in 2020, governments around the globe shut down schools. It affected over 90% of school children worldwide. On March 18, 2020 in Johannesburg, South Africa, students, schools, colleges, and universities experienced a complete shutdown. According to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, over 800 million learners from around the world have been affected. 1 in 5 learners could not attend school. 1 in 4 could not attend higher education classes. Third, recently in Western Asia and North Africa, the ongoing armed conflict has caused an increase in the number of children who are not attending school. Sub-Saharan Africa made the greatest progress in primary school enrollment among all developing regions, but large disparities remain. This is because the impact of COVID-19 has not been resolved yet. These countries have gradually collapsed because the economy has not developed due to the shutdown of shopping malls and big malls that people normally use on a daily basis. Then, in Indonesia, due to COVID-19, many schools were closed for almost 2 years because of the wealth gap. While rich people were able to let their children take online classes, others who couldn't afford online classes could not send their children to school. Even worse, the children couldn't study in India, where online classes were more expensive. As a result, many people suffered from education fees and children had to give up their dreams easily. Lastly, in South Korea, there was an experiment in order to understand the reality of the educational gap in the COVID-19 situation. An online survey was conducted on students, parents, and teachers of 800 elementary to high schools in Gyeonggi-do. Using the collected data, it was analyzed whether there is a difference in the educational conditions and process according to the economic level of the family, and what educational support the school provides to elevate this. As a result, the lower the economic level of the family is, the poorer the conditions for taking online classes are. And the more financial difficulties students have, the more difficult it is for them to understand the classes and perform tasks. However, rather than asking for help from teachers or parents, they often served or failed to serve it by themselves. On the other hand, in families with higher economic levels, parents are actively involved in learning activities while participating in their children's online classes and guiding them. Participation in private education was also significantly different by family backgrounds. Such educational differences can be related to educational inequality. They occur according to the economic level of the family, not to the individual's ability. However, the school's efforts and supports were found to be somewhat insufficient. Then you guys can see the map, and the red color of places affected more than green color of places.
Lastly, we're going to look at the solutions to educational inequality. Educational inequality refers to the disproportionate distribution of academic resources, such as school funding, qualified teachers and staff, and adequate school supplies to socially excluded communities. Therefore, reimagining what we can do for equality and equity relies on us. More progressive funding practices will lead to more opportunities for low-income students. Thus, here are some of the solutions for creating an equitable public education system and a successful educational justice movement. I'm going to first look at the solutions that the nation can help. The first economic support would be to provide books to low-income families and supporting tutors financially. One of the first ways that kids experience inequality in education is with their exposure to books, and it is a great way to give them a head start in their education. The second solution will be to expose citizens to free resources. Free education can be provided by resources on platforms like YouTube. The third solution will be to stop the expansion of private schools, as it may not be affordable for all students and can create segregation. Next, the solutions that the individuals can help. The first solution will be to raise awareness. Through this, we can make a campaign, have an interest in education inequality, or spread the information about educational inequality to people around us. The second solution will be to send help that goes through educational inequality, like donating money which can send digital devices to less economically developed countries, or participate in programs that helps countries that suffer from educational inequality, like how we're doing right now. If educational inequality rises, people who cannot get the education that develops critical thinking, which is vital in teaching a person how to use logic when making decisions, will grow. Therefore, I hope that educational inequality will grow less with these solutions. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I would like to welcome the last presentation for our team 4, and they will cover the gender equality.
So gender equality is an issue that requires much more attention and consideration than it receives at the moment. It affects the lives of countless women around the world, although invisibly. Our team has prepared a presentation on gender equality in hopes to raise awareness on the subject. My name is Layla, and I will begin by talking about a couple policies around the world that address gender equality and women's rights. The Charter of the United Nations is its founding document. It was signed on the 26th of June, 1945 in San Francisco at the conclusion of the United Nations Conference on International Organization and came into force on 24th of October, 1945. The United Nations can take action on a wide variety of issues due to its unique international character and the powers vested in its charter, which is considered an international treaty. The UN Charter codifies the major principles of international relations, from sovereign equality of states to the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. The concept of gender equality has been established within the core guiding principles of the United Nations and reflects commitment to the equality of men and women in all aspects of the human endeavor. More specifically, the Charter of the United Nations stipulate that there will be no restrictions on the eligibility of men and women to participate in every capacity and under conditions of equality in its principal and subsidiary organs. The next is the Beijing Platform for Action. as presented at the 1995 United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. It states that the United Nations must take measures to ensure women's equal access to and full participation in power structures and decision making. The UN specific objective states the following: implement existing and adopt new employment policies and measures in order to achieve overall gender equality, particularly at the professional level and above, by the year 2000, with due regard to the importance of recruiting staff on as wide a geographical basis as possible. Develop mechanisms to nominate women candidates for appointment to senior posts in the United Nations, the specialized agencies and other organizations and bodies of the United Nations system. Continue to collect and disseminate quantitative and qualitative data on women and men in decision making and analyze their differential impact on decision making and monitor progress towards achieving the Secretary General's target of having women hold 50% of managerial decision making positions by the year 2000. The next is the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. Their primary initiative is strengthening the institutional arrangements for support of gender equality and the empowerment of women. It further decides that the mandate and functions for the entity shall consist of a consolidated mandates and functions of the Office of the Special Advisor on Gender Issues and Advancement of Women, the Division for the Advancement of Women, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, and the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, with the additional role of leading, coordinating, and promoting the accountability of the United Nations system in its works on gender equality and the empowerment of women, and that any new mandate shall be subject to approval by intergovernmental processes. Lastly, for the policies in our own country, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family progresses toward an equal and sustainable democracy that women and men build together. Their objectives are to promote mature awareness of gender equality, increase women's employment and social participation, help women achieve a work-life balance, and enhance women's safety and health. They have 6 major projects and 22 implementation strategies, and I will talk about 3 of them, which I think are the most important and achievable. The first project is promoting awareness and culture of gender equality. It aims to combat gender discrimination in the mass media and enhance gender equality education in school. It also attempts to promote a gender equal culture in our daily lives and to raise the effectiveness of civic education on gender equality. The second is to ensure equal rights to work and opportunities. It promotes equal employment opportunities for men and women and addresses employment-related gender discrimination. It also enhances women's status in the labor market and provides support for women to maintain and advance their careers. The third is creating social infrastructure for work-life balance. This attempts to strengthen social responsibility for caregiving, guarantee work parents' maternal paternal rights, and foster a family-friendly culture in the workplace.
So now that Layla has covered general women's rights policies globally, Ellie and I will be diving into more specific women's rights issues. So I will start by describing how women were doing pre-COVID, so some fun history, as a certain virus drastically shifted the position of women in society. I'll be doing that based on 4 major categories: employment, education, violence, and mental health. So first, let's start off with employment. So if you go all the way back to the early 1800s in the Western world, or more specifically America, they were in the midst of the industrialization era. This era was seen as a starting point for the capitalist economy as production became more efficient due to huge technological advancements. This could be correlated with the growth of mills during this era. Middle-class women started working in these mills, most notably the Lowell mills, like in the picture on the left, but they were actually paid less than men and were expected to do all the housework. This can be explained using the widespread ideal at the time, which is the cult of domesticity, as you see on the right. This is a societal standard for women. Essentially what it did was it trapped women in a framework which was labeled as femininity, and it pressured women to stay pure, submissive, and domestic. So similar standards were in place on the other side of the globe. For example, in Korea during the Joseon dynasty, a woman's worth was dependent on her marital status, and they were expected to be housewives, as you can see in the images. Now, it was really only until World War II where there was a sharp increase in working women, as you can see by the second graph. There's like a huge spike. Men were sent away to war, and it was up to women to keep the country running. As you can see by the first picture, there was an increase in working women in Britain as well, and America even created Rosie the Riveter to get more women to join the workforce. However, after the war, many middle-class women felt the pressure to stay home even if they needed the extra money. A line in the book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963 by Betty Friedan states, if a woman had a problem in the 1950s and the 1960s, she knew that something must be wrong with her marriage or with herself. Other women were satisfied with their lives, she thought. What kind of woman was she if she did not feel this mysterious fulfillment to wax the floor? The base ideals of the cult of domesticity were still reflected during this period, which is why many women saw this dissatisfaction with being a housewife as being the problem. However, the entry of women in the workforce gave many women a sense of self-sufficiency and at least a small increase of respect in the workforce. With the second wave feminism during the 60s to the 70s, more women started working and paving their own path in the world. And finally, at the start of 2020, right before the pandemic, 50.04% of the workforce was made up of women, and that is just such an incredible improvement from what it was before. Second, I will be talking about education. There was a phenomenon called the reverse gap, where women were outperforming men in enrollments and education results, as you can see in the graph. This is different from before, when education for women wasn't seen as mandatory. Not only did women get an increase in education, they were also able to study a much more diverse number of majors. If we go back to the feminine mystique, there was a line that stated, but girls would not study physics. It was unfeminine. In fact, only 1% of engineering majors in the 60s were women. Now, as you can see by the graph below, there is actually an increase in women studying STEM. Even if there was an increase in women studying STEM-based majors, I feel like the statistics don't show much drastic change, as many may think. I think, frankly, we could, as a society, do so much better on this issue. And in developing countries, education is actually still an issue for many women. In fact, in Somalia, only 95% of women between the ages of 7 to 16 have never received education. Another example are women in India. They are busy collecting water or expected to do housework, which strips their chance to be educated. Third, let's look at violence. So 1 in 35 women are sexually assaulted yearly. 90% of adult rape victims are women. 200 million women alive today have had female genital mutilation, and 1 in 2 women have been raped by their ex or current partner. So as you can tell by the statistics, it's pretty alarming the amount of violence women face, and women pre-COVID were still just facing an immense amount of violence. Lastly, let's go to mental health. So if we go back to the problem of women feeling an unknown problem in the 60s, their legitimate mental health issues were being dismissed. This is best stated in another line in The Feminine Mystique. So the first quote states, the problem was dismissed by telling the housewife she doesn't realize how lucky she is. Her own boss, no time clock, no junior executive gunning for a job. What if she isn't happy? Does she think men are happy in this world? And the second quote is, but the actual unhappiness of the housewife was suddenly being reported, although everyone who talked about it found some superficial reason to dismiss it. So women are actually starting to get more and more therapy, as you can see by the graph. However, there was still a lack of care for postpartum depression. So essentially, postpartum depression is depression women face after childbirth. In fact, if you look at the statistics, 1 in 10 women face postpartum depression, but 50% of those women don't get medically diagnosed. Most of those women don't even receive adequate care. And to end this section on a good note, women psychologists actually started taking stands to study psychology for women, which is great because lots of psychologists back in the day would experiment only on men and would generalize those experimental results to women. But psychologists like Karen Horney criticized a prominent psychologist named Freud on his depiction of women and brought much attention to the psychology of men. Thank you.
My name is Elisa, and I'll be talking about the post-COVID gender consequences following on what Alicia has talked about. Now, I'll see this in 5 different aspects. First, the economic stance. Second, education. Third, violence and abuse. Fourth, mental health. And lastly, post-COVID policies. Now, first, let's take a look at unemployment under economic stance. As Alicia told us, before COVID-19, the unemployment rates of women were decreasing drastically, and women made up almost 39 to 50% of the global employment. But after COVID-19, they accounted for 54% of the global job losses. And the reason behind this is because women and men tend to clump to certain jobs and employment. For example, there are more women statistically employed in the food industry, which was one of the biggest industries impacted by COVID-19. And because of this, COVID-19 directly affected many women, as they were cut in much larger numbers than their male counterparts. And this is why women's jobs were 1.8 times more vulnerable to this crisis than men's jobs. However, we can take a look at the picture on the screen. This is a picture by McKinsey & Company, which compares what will happen to female unemployment if we take action now, if we wait to take action, and if we do nothing. And we can see that if we take action now, we can reverse the effects of COVID-19 and even go further. However, if we do nothing, it's literally a -1. Nothing will happen, and rather it will only get worse. However, the problem doesn't stop at unemployment. It extends to poverty. Now, women were trapped in extreme poverty because they were pushed into unemployment and unpaid childcare. Unpaid childcare is a status rooted in the gender norms and the social roles of our society, which expects women to take up the childcare in the family, which means that women who are employed have to go out to work and come back home to spend hours upon hours taking care of their children without getting any pay at all. And especially during COVID-19, because children were staying home, this work only increased. And it's estimated that the pandemic and the worsening inequality will push 198 million people into extreme poverty during 2022, completely reversing the effects of progress. And as the picture shows, women aged from 25 to 34 globally are 25% more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. And this idea of economic stance connects directly with goal number 5, more specifically target 5.1 and 5.4, which outline eliminating all discrimination from women and making sure that women have a substitution for that unpaid childcare. Next, we can move on to education. Before COVID-19, the dropout rates for men were much higher than women. However, during COVID-19, the dropout rates for women and young girls spiked drastically. And the reason behind this is money, early marriage and pregnancy, and social norms. Money was a big problem for many families, but on top of that, there was this ideology because of our social norms that if young girls stay home during COVID-19 without even getting a proper education, they should just be married off to an adult man. Now, women and girls were 11% more likely to drop out of school during the COVID pandemic compared to men and boys. And 20 million more secondary school age girls could be out of school after the crisis has passed. Now, this directly affects SDG targets 5.1 and 5.5, which outline that women deserve a fair chance at employment. However, with the high dropout rates, it's only getting harder and harder for women to get a proper employment. Next, we can take a look at one of the most serious problems of the pandemic, the domestic violence. And this was actually given a name because it was so severe, and it's called the shadow pandemic. Women were entrapped in their homes during COVID-19 with a lack of access to safety, which meant that they couldn't run away to shelters, which were mostly closed down, and they couldn't ask for help because they were with their partner 24/7. And globally, an estimated 245 million women and girls aged from 15 to 49 have been subjected to sexual and or physical violence by an intimate partner in just the first year of the pandemic. And in the Save the Children survey, they saw that children also saw higher rates of violence when schools were closed. This is not where the violence stops, because child marriage and FGMs, female genital mutilation, only increase. Now, the pandemic caused delays in the program to end FGMs, and it also caused countless dropouts because of lack of money that led to so many more children being married off. Even young adolescents from age 5 to 10 married off to grown men in their 40s. Now, this resulted in an estimated 2 million more cases of FGM, and as a result of the pandemic, UNICEF estimated that 10 million additional child marriages may occur before 2030. And this once again relates to our SDG goals and targets 5.2 and 5.3, which say that we must eliminate child marriage and FGMs because they are a clear violation of human rights. Lastly, we can take a look at the mental health of women during the pandemic. More specifically, suicide. Being isolated with so many of the problems listed above was too much for the woman to bear alone. On top of that, most of the women ended up being unemployed. And this led to one of the most dangerous emotions that can happen to a human being, as proven by countless psychologists, which is helplessness. Women in their 20s and 30s in Korea were taken to the hospital after attempts at suicide, which had risen by 43%. However, instead of ending this on a dismal note, I want to take a look lastly at the policies by the government and by the citizens. Now, this was enacted by Canada, Australia, Mexico, China, Spain, Argentina, France, Colombia, and Costa Rica, and even more countries. However, instead of focusing on what the government did, I want to focus on one particular example of what the citizens did. Now, take a look at China. The hashtag anti-domestic violence during the pandemic movement was a movement where you would report on social media channels your domestic violence, and they would provide you shelters or support. And this showed us that despite the fact that governments do need to pay attention to domestic violence and the women who are suffering in unemployment, we as citizens can take a stance up to work for each other.
Although evidence show that gender inequality exists, a notion of denying it is spreading like wildfire. Hello, this is Han Lee, and in section 4, what I'm going to introduce is the anti-feminist backlash happening all around the globe. Below are the table of contents. After briefly explaining the definition of anti-feminist backlash, I'll move on to the analysis of the general perception toward feminism. Then I'll move on to 3 example cases of anti-feminist movements. Firstly, we have to understand the term. What is backlash? Backlash is basically a strong negative reaction by a large number of people, for example, to something that has recently changed in a society. So anti-feminist backlash is backlash against feminists and feminism. It's not that perception toward feminism of the 21st century is miserable. There are ongoing notions about feminism, and through the years, it's clear that the global society has made progress to secure women's rights. Politicians and celebrities are publicly speaking up, supporting feminism. And that is a reflection of a part of the world's population's attitude toward feminism and women's rights. For example, Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, once said, "We shouldn't be afraid of the word feminist. Men and women should use it to describe themselves." And that is Benedict Cumberbatch right there, wearing the "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt. However, there is also a rising notion of anti-feminism, and this has become a major idea in some societies, as you can see in the example of South Korea. Here, I brought an example of a Korean right-wing politician, Lee Jun-suk's remarks, "Do not force feminism." His remarks show that many people don't recognize feminism as an urgent, universal human rights movement. Advocating human rights differs from an act of forcing a personal ideology, yet some politicians are using feminism to create political conflicts that they need. And sadly, it is almost always feminists they target for political attacks. Hospitality toward feminist movement grew so intense to the point of creating a new social syndrome, which is named the "although I'm not a feminist" syndrome. It's a tendency of avoiding to be seen as a feminist, though agreeing that gender inequality exists and needs to be fixed. The following contents will introduce actual data to show that the perception of people have toward feminism has worsened throughout the years. The surveys are done in South Korea, so before moving on, I'd like to mention that there's a specific tendency in Korea of recognizing feminism as a radical ideology hostile to men. According to a survey done last year, 2021, it shows that the younger generation tends to disagree to the notion of women experiences serious discrimination, as shown in the chart. Now, this result becomes much more drastic when it involves the word feminism. We could take a look at a survey done this year on the topic of gender inequality and women's rights policies. The 3 questions of the surveys were: first, do you support feminism? Second, do women experience more discrimination than men? And lastly, should policy supporting women be expanded? The results of 3 different survey questions are revealed to reflect a common recognition toward feminism and policy supporting women. As the ages of the respondents decrease, the gap between male gender and female gender increases. Younger generation are either extremely supportive or extremely unsupportive to the idea of feminism depending on the gender. Now, this is understandable because there were progress to reduce gender inequality, and naturally, the younger generation experience less gender discrimination in their daily lives. But we have to note that what forms a societal norm is the culture of the upper generation, the generation which holds more political power and capital. But the younger generation lacks the insight to see through the whole social phenomenon. Rather, the sights are limited into the experience they go through. This gap of their experience and the social norm, it creates a misunderstanding towards feminist movements and incorrect beliefs, which eventually leads to anti-feminist movements. Now, I'll introduce 3 cases around the globe of anti-feminist movements. One example is Louisiana's abortion war. In the year 1973, Louisiana was one of the pro-abortion states, 54% of the citizens strongly agreeing to the legalization of abortion. However, after the famous Roe decision, legally allowing right to abortion, Catholics and evangelist communities united under the purpose of securing religious values and the right to live. Since then, Louisiana became the epicenter of anti-abortion movements. This movement underwent changes that could be divided into 3 phases as seen below. First, it started as a flow of judicial or legislative activities of passing laws limiting the procedure of abortion. Then in phase 2, it shifted to direct violence toward clinics. And then third, the recent decade, it returned to the judicial realm. But during the second phase, which involved violent activities, there were some life-threatening crimes. For example, in 1985, 2 women's clinics in Louisiana had to suffer from a bomb threat and arson attacks, violence toward women, and clinics which provided abortion surgeries. Well, this movement of anti-feminism is not only limited to highly spotlighted political issues like abortion, it also influences the field of education. In the United States, women's scholarship and awards are being eliminated due to the decision of the Department of Education responding to complaints that women's scholarship are discriminative to men. And this flow of anti-feminism flowed right into the political field too. Even a decade ago, anti-feminism hasn't been blatantly used as an election strategy. However, in the 2020s, gender conflict is such an issue that it became a powerful political tool. Politicians are actively using this tool to earn a victory in elections. Politicians are bringing gender quota system and gender equality to the debate table, increasing the conflict of gender. However, we have to note that when data shows inequality exists, there is no time to waste denying.
Women and men must enjoy equal opportunities, choices, capabilities, power, and knowledge as equal citizens. Equipping girls and boys, women and men with knowledge, values, attitudes, and skills to tackle gender disparities is a precondition to building a sustainable future for all. Let's
Make
Change.
Happen.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the presentations. And as been introduced, I would like to take a little break of 10 minutes for everyone and for the evaluation committee for the decisions. So please, everyone, you did a great job for all. Please be back by 45, and there will be a closing ceremony and the awarding announcement. Welcome back, everyone. So I guess everyone is here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so passionate and supportive to the United Nations 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. The active engagement of youth in sustainable development efforts is being more and more central, including the impacts of climate change, such as by Team 3, fundamental social development as stressed by Team 1, economic crisis emphasized by Team 5, education issues covered by Team 2, and finally, gender equality as discussed by Team 4. As we have committed on the very first day, please all the youth be aware of the global problems, become active global citizens, and support and improve the world with your knowledge and skills. So we are grateful to be able to celebrate the graduation day once more. Despite the fact that we are still dealing with the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that we are here today to celebrate graduation is a great blessing for us. Let us welcome the graduating of the 19th training program on the United Nations and SDGs together. To inspire our graduates, we shall now hear an important message from our President Jin-Han Chung.
여러분 안녕하세요. 유엔 공보부 협력 지휘를 획득한 사단법인 미래희망기구 이사장 정진환입니다. 제19기 유엔 전문가 교육에 참여해 주신 모든 학생분들, 지난 5일간의 교육을 수료하게 된 것을 진심으로 축하합니다. 여러분들이 만들어낸 모든 가치 있는 노력에 감사를 먼저 전합니다. 유엔 본부, 또 유엔 공보국, 유엔 투어팀, 유엔 군축실 등 24개의 강연기관들과 함께 진행된 이번 교육이 쉽지만은 않았습니다. 매년 2, 3회씩 뉴욕과 스위스 제네바 유엔 본부에서 9박 11일간은 진행되던 교육을 코로나로 인해서 온라인으로 전면 진행하게 되었는데, 그럼에도 지난 5일간의 교육과 활동 시간이 여러분들에게 기억에 남는 시간이 되었기를 바랍니다. 2022년, 지금 한 가지 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 여러분들은 얼마나 협력하고 있나요? 2019년 12월 첫 코로나 확진자가 나온 뒤로 벌써 2년 반이라는 시간이 지나고 전 세계의 인권, 환경, 교육 상황은 바이러스로 인해 새로운 국면을 맞이하고 이에 점차 적응해가는 모습마저 보이고 있습니다. 유엔 공보국의 협력 NGO로서 국내 그리고 국외에 유엔이 2030년까지 달성하기로 결의한 지속 가능 발전 목표의 달성을 촉구하고 동참을 독려하는 것이 저희 미래희망기구의 가장 큰 비전이자 미션이라 할 수 있습니다. 이번 강연에서 수많이 언급되었듯이 이러한 목표들을 달성하는 것은 비단 유엔 또 각 국가의 지도자, 기업들만의 일이 아닙니다. 이번 교육에서 제시되었던 문제들을 많은 학생들이 고민해보고 여러분들 스스로 청소년의 입장에서 문제를 해결하려고 노력하는 과정에서 전에는 깨닫지 못했던 새로운 교훈을 얻기를 희망합니다. 또한 코로나 시대에 맞춰서 전 세계적으로 변화되어 가고 있는 시스템과 국제 정세의 다양한 분야에 깊이 탐구하는 시간을 보냈기를 바랍니다. 매년 10월 24일이 무슨 날인지 아시나요? 바로 유엔의 날입니다. 지난 30여 년간의 유엔의 존재 덕분에 우리는 덜 위험하고 덜 억압받고 덜 가난한 세계에서 살고 있습니다. 하지만 여전히 세계 도처에는 크고 작은 전쟁이 끊이지 않고 인권을 보호받지 못하는 사람들이 있고 지속적인 빈곤으로 삶을 영위해 나가기 어려운 수준의 사람들도 있습니다. 그 누구도 뒤처지지 않는 세상과 인류의 공동의 번역을 위해 유엔이 하고 있는 역할에 여러분들도 기여할 수 있기를 바랍니다. 대한민국은 이제 선진국의 반열에 어깨를 나란히 하며 세계 여러 곳의 사각지대와 각 위험 사항에 처해 있는 개발도상국에 도움의 손길을 줌으로써 이제는 국제사회에서 당당히 주목받는 한 국가로서 역할을 수행하고 있습니다. 지난 시간 대한민국이 걸어온 길이 힘겨운 발전의 길이라고 할 수도 있지만 여러분과 같은 글로벌 리더의 꿈과 투지, 열정이 늘 저희에게 동기부여가 되어 함께 미래를 이루어 나가는 양분이 되어 주었다고 생각합니다. 이렇게 다 같이 세계 시민으로서 국제적 이슈를 해결하고자 하는 교육의 과정을 거치고 다양한 문제들에 대한 해법을 모색하고 반짝이는 아이디어로 여러분이 위치한 곳에서 스스로 변화하고 노력하는 것부터가 시작이며 이러한 행동들이 여러분들이 자신의 시각을 다양화하고 다각화하는 데 큰 도움이 될 것이라고 생각합니다. 이번 제19기 유엔 전문가 교육에 참여함으로써 국제사회를 다양한 분야의 전문가들과 함께 탐구해본 경험을 바탕 삼아서 우리 학생들이 앞으로 유엔과 같은 글로벌 무대에서 중심을 잡아줄 수 있는 역량 있는 사람으로 성장하기를 기대합니다. 또한 이번 교육이 여러분들의 열정과 목표를 발견하고 그에 한 걸음 더 다가갈 수 있는 특별한 계기가 되었기를 희망합니다. 앞으로 우리가 맞이할 미래를 위한 전 지구적 과제의 해결에 적극적으로 참여하고 여러분들이 가지고 있는 세계 시민으로서의 역량을 발휘하고 창의적 해법을 탐구하고 성찰할 수 있는 귀한 시간을 보내면서 국제적 인재로 거듭날 수 있기를 진심으로 응원합니다. 5일간 수고한 여러분들과 사단법인 미래희망기구는 늘 함께하겠습니다. 대단히 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and insightful message for the students. Your word will surely guide our graduates as they tread a new path in their lives. The highlight of our program has come. It is time for giving the certificates and awards. Talents, skills, and most importantly, the mindset of the global citizenships are the crops that are nurtured, groomed, and given all the possible opportunities to grow and bloom. This graduation day is a celebration of the harvest of this crop. You are all indeed change makers. On behalf of the staff and speakers, we joyfully congratulate all the graduates. We sincerely thank all the students for the commitment and leadership that you have shown throughout the program. All students increase awareness of the accomplishment of 17 goals, join together and fight the injustices committed against youth, and lastly, learn from friends and spread best practices. You, the youth, are taking the lead and contributing in implementing global solutions. And let us then proceed with the presenting the awards to the winning teams from the SDGs presentation. Content of the presentation, clarity and flow of the presentation, and contribution to the youth action have been taken into consideration for this award and was evaluated by the staff and board committee of the HFA as well as the speakers. The number of awarding teams will be released soon. There's more than one. So, first of all, we would like to present the best team for an overall performance for the presentation. Everyone, please unmute yourself and drum roll, please. And the winning team is Team 5. Yay! With dedicating team spirit and outstanding presentation, the presentation by Team 5 has suggested the fruitful collaboration for all sectors on international, local, and an individualistic level for the common goal. Congratulations to Unu, Ahyun, Taewon, Taeyong, and Taeun. And this is not all. Next, I would like to present the winning team for the Best Presentation Award. Drum roll, everyone, please. Now, the winner of the Best Presentation Award is Team 4. Haeun, Eunso, Lee, and Yesong have especially shown excellent performance in their speeches, making the best for their oral presentation. All information was delivered with clarity, which made the speech driving and persuasive. Congratulations to Team 4. And there are some remaining winning teams. Next, I'll be happy to announce the winner of Remarkable Team Spirit Award. In honor of showing the essence of teamwork, Team 2 has tried hard for the betterment of the team with flexibility and shown commitment to team over self. A round of applause to Jiho, Seoyun, Taeyeon, Junhyun, and Chaemin. And guess what? This is not all. All of you worked hard. All of you did perfect. I'm so happy to be able to celebrate more winners. For the award of Outstanding Academic Researches, the winning team is Team 3. Team 3's presentation was very detailed based on all areas of environment challenges the world has been facing. Congratulations to Tae, Youngyun, Woojin, Yuha, and Seungwon. And lastly, the winner of the collaborative attitude is Team 1. Team 1 has shown an endless amount of effort for collaboration during the presentation, making the most students engage in their speeches. Given that the motivation for each individual is crucial to the implementation of the SDG goals, Minjung, Taeyong-gyu, Taeyong-lee, and Hyungjun's action for the collaboration for SDGs has been dominant. Actually, there were about 10 people who have been engaged in this evaluation procedure, including staff from HFA, lecturers from the program, including 1 ambassador, 2 professors, and 2 speakers. We have provided the criteria for the award in advance, and there were many different opinions on who'd win the award. And after a long discussion, we ended up giving awards to all of you, considering your remarkable attitude toward this harsh and tight schedules. This is not what I have assumed, since I have been telling the students that there will be only 1 award. But it's prominent that we are all proud of you. And finally, we are nearing the end of our program. And thank you all for participating in this harsh schedules for 5 days. And with just 8 years left to achieve the 17 goals and 169 targets, the role of young people seems to be very critical. We would like to again stress the importance of the active engagement of the youth and achieving sustainable, inclusive, and even stable societies. Everyone, please unmute yourself and let's read the declaration out loud to recommit ourselves for the strongest partnership. Youth Declaration. We, the youth
We, the youth representatives of Hope to the Future Association, gather
here in Seoul,
the Republic of Korea, 19 training program of the United Nations
program of the
United
Nations
Conference
the
to
values
strengthen
of
and self-seek problems and achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of United Arab
Sustainable work together we
couple actions that can benefit all of humanity. We will
work together to undertake sustainable actions
building
benefit all of humanity.
resources and
Continue to work toward ending
to live in harmony with nature
violence and building sustainable and lasting peace. We share responsibility for
We will work to remove all forms of discrimination
minimize the human-made
work to minimize
classification, race, ethnicity,
work to remove
politically will work to minimize
sex, gender, sexual
political
orientation,
affiliation, undesirable individuals with
economic status,
progress for
appearance,
and our humanity.
able to
Socioeconomic status, the right to determine our future,
we
civic
are
must right to ensure to all.
including the right to determine our civic participation must also be a right to ensure
rights,
to all.
including the right to determine our future civic participations and the right to ensure to all.
Thank you all. So you worked hard and you succeeded. This program has come to its closing, and enjoy your day of celebration with your family and friends. Thank you very much, everyone. And I would like to stop recording the closing ceremony and would love to take a very last group photo for ourselves.